So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming. I'm delighted you're all here. It's great to see so many friendly faces in the audience. So first of all, a big thank you to Caoimhe Ninil and Laura Sherlock and the whole alumni team for inviting me to give this talk and participate in this history series. As Caoimhe said, I'm a graduate and a fellow of the college, and it's a great honour for me to be able to contribute to this series of lectures and follow in the footsteps of Ronan Kelly and Joe Dignan, as Caoimhe said, whose first two lectures, which were absolutely fantastic. So the size of the audience here today suggests that there is considerable interest in the history of medicine in Ireland. And a lot of what has been written and spoken about relates to the history of the late 18th and early 19th century, the so-called golden age of Irish medicine, of Graves, Stokes, Adams, and so on. But today, I want to try and bring you back to the period before that, to the medieval era and early modern time, which is probably less studied, but just as interesting, I think, anyway. So the trouble with Irish history is always to know where to start and how to break it up into digestible sections. So this slide shows what's known as a periodization chart or a timeline for Irish history from prehistory to modern times. And you'd be glad to know I'm not going to go through it all. Medicine was practiced throughout all of these periods, but I want to concentrate on the experience of late medieval and early modern eras, roughly from 1200 to 1650 AD. And that is between the coming of the Normans, which was in 1169, and the founding of the College of Physicians, which started as a fraternity of physicians in 1654 and later a college, and then just predated the founding of the medical school in Trinity College in 1711. And I think those two events really marked the beginning of modern medicine in Ireland. So I want to look at the period before that, and I hope you'll be interested in what I have to say. So medieval medicine is a huge subject, and I can only give you a glimpse of what is known about its practice in Ireland in this talk. So here's an overview of what I hope to cover. So first of all, I want to talk about late medieval Ireland and the two cultures that dominated the country at the time. I want to talk about the Gaelic world and the Gaelic doctors. I want to talk about the English of Ireland and their medicine. Then I want to talk about some elements of medieval medicine upon which both groups base their practice. And lastly, there are some individual patients that can be identified in the records, and we'll say a little bit about them. The whole era came to an end in the 17th century, and we'll say a little bit about that, and then I'll mention some sources at the very end. So the period from late 12th to early 17th century was dominated by a clash of two cultures and two nations on the island of Ireland. Irish-speaking Gaelic clans dominated the western and northern regions of the country and across the North Channel into the west of Scotland, while the descendants of the Anglo-Normans, who like to call themselves the English of Ireland, occupied the eastern and southern parts of the island. And a famous document entitled The State of Ireland and Plan for its Reformation, prepared for the 24-year-old Henry VIII in 1515, it was stated that there may be more than 60 counties called regions in Ireland inhabited by the king's Irish enemies. In other words, the Gaelic Irish. In the eyes of the English of England, many of the descendants of the Anglo-Normans had, inverted commas, degenerated and adopted Gaelic ways of living, earning them the label of the King's English rebels in the same document. So they were the English of Ireland. So first of all, I want to discuss the Gaelic world and its doctors. In the late medieval period, Gaelic society and culture prospered not only in Ireland, but also in the west of Scotland, especially from the mid-12th century with the overthrow of Norse domination of the southern Hebrides. By 1400, clear differences existed between the Gaelic highlands known as the Gaeltacht and the Scots or English-speaking lowlands known as the Galdacht. The historian Kenneth MacNichols wrote that Gaelic society was a society of clans or lineages, forming a definite corporate entity with political and legal functions. As a group, the clan, or shlucht as it was known in Irish, occupied particular lands or territories, and the chief of the clan was advised by a literate, privileged, hereditary, learned class. In the words of Sir James Ware, an 18th century historian, as they, the chiefs, had brehons of one sept or family, so also they had historians, physicians, chirurgeons, poets, and harpers of other peculiar septs, to each one of which certain lands were assigned. And we know that the medical families generally had about 250 to 400 acres in this arrangement. This image on the right, which I think is amazing medieval artwork, is from a manuscript in Cambridge, and it shows the Scots king Alexander III being eulogized by his Gaelic bard, or Olav Ree, at his coronation in 1249. So medicine was practiced by hereditary medical families, and the identities of many of these families and their patrons is known. So Nullig O'Murrilla, another historian, identified 50 Gaelic medical families active during the late medieval and early modern period in Ireland and Scotland. From the etymology of their names, it appears that a number of the kindreds had been practicing medicine for a long time, possibly as early as the 8th century. So MacLean, or Lee, comes from Machan Laga, meaning the son of a physician, from the Irish Lia, meaning a leech, while O'Hickada, from the Irish Icade, meaning healer, translates to a descendant of a healer. Macbaha, also Macbeth, Bethune, and Beaton, means the son of life. The Scottish historian John Bannerman identified 76 members of this distinguished family who dominated medicine in Scotland from the 14th to the 17th centuries. Another Scottish medical family's name was Leach or Lech, and Christine Leach successfully treated a servant of the king in 1443, indicating that women practice medicine in this Gaelic world. In passing, I should note that Christine Leach is the only named Gaelic woman practitioner I can find, but there were others, and the term Banlia was used in the Old Irish laws to indicate a woman practitioner. So Catherine Sims, a historian from Trinity, has observed that the lack of a university in Ireland in the late medieval period forced the Gaelic medical students or potential students to travel abroad to gain degrees such as Bachelor of Physics. One of these was Johannes de Killalach O'Canine from Meath, who was a Bachelor of Medicine from Montpellier in 1330. Two others were Cormac Mac Dunsleva from Donegal and Tygo Kuhn from Clare, who were both described as Basilaire a Physiacht, in other words, a Bachelor in Physics, but unfortunately we don't know from what universities. Donica Dunsleva was also described as a Doctor of Medicine, and James Nealon, an Irishman, probably a member of the O'Neillon medical kindred from Clare, graduated in medicine in the University of Oxford in 1549. Owen O'Shiel returned to Ireland with his doctor's degree in 1620, having studied in Louvain, Padua, Rome, and Paris. However, some doctors trained at home in medical schools run by the hereditary families. The one we know most about is the O'Crohur Medical School at Amachart near Cullehill in County Laois, which flourished from 1500 to 1611. It was under the patronage of the McGillepodrigs or Fitzpatricks, who were barons of Upper Ossory. One of the McGillepodrigs was the first Gaelic lord to accept the surrender and regrant policy of Henry VIII. So this is Cullohill Castle, and it was left in this state by Cromwell's canons in 1650. 6 members of the family of the O'Cruhurs across 4 generations practiced medicine, the most important of whom was Donnacha Og O'Cruhur, who's there, who was described as Príomh Ullmh Leish, in other words, the head professor of medicine, and described as the best of doctors in his own time, and that without leaving Ireland to study. So this shows that it was possible to train fully in medicine in Ireland at the time. Some of the students can be recognized in the school here in this list. And the list includes 2 Scottish students, Donnacha Albanoch O'Cruhur, Albanoch meaning that he was from Scotland, and Neil MacUmmer, showing the free interaction between the Gaelic parts of Ireland and Scotland during this period. In both communities, the language would have been Gaelic or Irish, and they would have had no difficulty in understanding each other. So there was free interaction between the 2 communities. Donnacha returned to Scotland in 1600 and became the hereditary physician to the MacDougall of Dunolly, and the ruins of the castle that Donnacha went back to are still to be seen in Dunolly, which is just north of Oban in the west of Scotland. And this is the castle in Dunolly. So it's likely that a small number of the Gaelic physicians, wherever they were trained, encountered classical Latin medical texts and translated them into Irish. 2 of the best translators were the aforementioned Cormac Mac Dunsleva and Tadhg O'Kuan. Cormac is known to have translated at least 9 texts from Latin into Irish, while Tadhg produced a magnificent Materia Medica from at least 4 different Latin sources, some of which had been translated from Arabic, probably by the famous Benedictine monk Constantine Africanus at Monte Cassino in Italy. To give you an example of some of the script or a page from a text that was translated, this is from a translation by Cormac Mac Dunsleva of Guy de Chauliac's Chirurgia Magna, which Guy wrote around 1314, I think. So Cormac's translation was about 100 years later. And we know that he wrote it because he tells us here at the bottom of page 35. And you can see it says in Irish, Tornig an sin anatomy o Guido. All right, I can't point to you. Agus Cormac Mac Dunsleva de Queer an Gaelga E. And you can see that they often in their writing left out letters, presumably to cut down on the amount of vellum that they had to use. So you can see the AR is united into one letter here, and these lines over the ends mean that letters have been left out. So it's kind of shorthand text rather than an easily read text. So you can see it's quite difficult to get to grips with these texts. Now I want to turn to the descendants of the Anglo-Normans, known as the English of Ireland. So the Normans arrived in Ireland in 1169 and quickly dominated much of the east and south of the island, setting up a system of manors and boroughs ruled by powerful lords loyal to the English king. And this polity became known as the Lordship of Ireland and lasted until 1541, when Henry VIII assumed the title King of Ireland. This little symbol of the 3 crowns was the emblem for the Lordship of Ireland, and here you can see it displayed on a silver groat of Henry VII, which was minted in Dublin in 1487. a groat was worth 4 pence. Giraldus Cambrensis was a Norman monk who visited Ireland in the late 12th century, shortly after the Norman invasion. And he observed the island has little use for doctors. However, by the early 14th century, a hierarchy of medical professions had emerged in the Anglo-Norman lordship. At the top was a small number of university-trained physicians. Next were skilled medical and surgical practitioners without university degrees, followed by barbers or barber surgeons associated with guilds, and finally apothecaries, midwives, and empirics. The latter just treated one thing, like a cataract or a hernia or possibly a fracture. As it took 10 years of study to become a physician, there were very few of them in medieval Ireland. Remember, there was no university in the country until Trinity College was founded in 1592. A reference to a society of surgeons distinct from the barber surgeons indicates the presence of professional surgeons in Dublin before 1570, but when their society was founded is unknown. Archaeology has shown evidence of expert surgical skill in trephination, drilling holes into the head, and limb amputation. And the Scottish records contain references to the horrendous operation of cutting for stone. Apothecaries, also known at the time as spicers, as well as midwives and empirics, were also known. So in the records, medics are often referred to as just as leech or medicus. So it can be quite difficult to know what kind of practitioner any given individual was. This little emblem here is the crest or the coat of arms of the Guild of Barber Surgeons in Dublin, which was awarded to them by Henry VI in 1446. But significantly, the Gaelic Irish were not invited to be members of the Guild. You had to be of the English nation. So many institutions of care existed among the English of Ireland. Firstly, there were monastic infirmaries, although these also existed in Gaelic Ireland. The sick or the infirm members of the religious community were cared for in the infirmary, which was often a separate building from the main claustral complex as shown here in Adair. In others, the infirmary hall type, the sick were in a hall that communicated directly with the chapel, affording the inmates the opportunity of hearing the church's offices. So this example here is from a medieval hospital in Beaune in Burgundy. And you can see the beds where the patients are all lined up on the side of the hall, which is the chapel, with the altar would be up at the top. So the patients were in these cubicles, and there were curtains on each side of the cubicle. So if attendants wanted to do something to the patient, they could close off the curtains to the room, deal with the patient, and then open them up again when they were finished. So occasionally, elderly monks and benefactors of the community were permitted to pass their final days in the monastic infirmary. The name hospital and its derivatives, spidel, spital, and spital, are found at least 17 times in the place names of Ireland. The word hospital derives from the medieval Latin hospitale, a place of reception for travellers, pilgrims, and strangers. Later, it indicated an asylum for the care of the sick or the wounded. And the exact number in Ireland in the medieval period is unknown, but it seems there were approximately 120 institutions called hospital, and many of them were leper hospitals. However, it is not clear that medical treatments were provided in any of them. They were more likely places of refuge for poor and destitute people. The hospital we know most about is the Priory of St. John the Baptist without the Newgate, Dublin, founded by Aelred de Palmer and his wife in 1188. It is where the Church of St. Augustine and St. John now is in Thomas Street. So this is a picture done by Berenger in the 1780s, and The tower of the hospital was still standing at that time when Berenger did his work. The Archbishop of Cashel, Moranius O'Brien, observed in 1225, "By the evidence of my own eyes, I know the house of St. John is so charged with a multitude of sick persons that it is barely able to maintain them." So you can see overcrowding is nothing new in Irish hospitals. The register for the hospital has survived, and we know that it had 155 patients in the early 1300s, but this had reduced to 50 patients at the time of its suppression in 1539. Excuse me. Now, I want to say briefly a little about the medicine that the medieval physicians, whether they were Gaelic or Anglo-Norman, practiced. So the theory of medicine came from the classical world and was derived from the works of Aristotle, Hippocrates, and Galen, who had lived more than 1,000 years previously. The writings of Arab physicians of the first millennium also contributed to their thinking. They believed there were 3 digestions: the first in the stomach, the second in the liver, and the third in the peripheries of the body. Blood did not circulate. It was made in the liver, and some of it passed through theoretical microscopic channels from the right side of the heart to the left side of the heart. And both arteries and veins delivered the blood around the body where it was consumed in the third digestion. There were 3 spirits, animal, vital, and natural, which were associated with the brain, the heart, and the liver, respectively. Most importantly, there were 4 humors: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. And a person's temperament or complexion was based on the humoral composition and qualities of heat, dry, wet, and cold. We still use these humoral terms to describe people as being sanguine, phlegmatic, melancholic, or choleric. And the cause of disease was the disruption of the correct balance of the humors and the altered complexion. So this is why you got into trouble. So that was the theory. To diagnose illness, the physician first took a medical history and then examined the patient. However, I think this doctor here would not have passed his final med exams in RCSI for not getting the patient to lie down before he attempted to examine the abdomen. Examining the pulse was also hugely important, but it's very interesting because we know they didn't have watches at the time, so measuring the pulse was quite a difficult thing to do. So they assumed that their own pulse was normal, typical physicians. And related the patient's pulse to that. Examining the urine was hugely important. It was believed that the urine reflected the status of the humors in the body, and that you could tell from simply looking at the urine which humor was out of kilter and thereby make a diagnosis. It was so useful that some physicians didn't bother to look at the patient, but were able to diagnose what was wrong just by uroscopy. For example, Dr. Nicholas Hickey, a freeman of the city of Dublin, charged 6pence to examine the urine and 12pence if he had to go to the bother of actually seeing the patient. So here are some examples of what are called urine charts, which showed the physician what the problem was based on the color of the urine. The chart on the left is one from England where the urine flasks have been colored in to show what the urine would look like in any given illness. The one on the right is the only extant Gaelic urine chart, and it's in the University of Edinburgh Library in the Lang collection. But you can see it is not colored. And I think it's not colored probably because they never got around to doing the coloring. And there's no reason why they wouldn't have colored it. And you see in the manuscript sometimes the capital letters at the beginnings of paragraphs have been left blank with the intention of doing rubrication or coloring and creating a very nice capital later on. but it never happened. So in lots of manuscripts, you see a blank or a small little letter indicating what should be put there, but it was never done. And I think probably this is the same problem. However, a description of the color is provided to guide the physician and perhaps the colorist. So for example, the one I have highlighted here at the top, this one here, says lividus mar da in luiga, which means livid like the color of lead. And it and two other colors, which are also shades of black, are grouped together, indicating that death is near. So in Irish it says, Iad seo na trí daha signuigus in bos afogus. These are the three colors that signify approaching death. Now, you're all cleverer than I am, but the only condition that I know that gives dark black urine like that is myoglobinuria, which without treatment would certainly be fatal. So I'd like to thank Evie Donica, who's here today, for translating the Irish script for me. Thank you very much, Evie. So having made the diagnosis, we turn to therapeutics. Both the Gaelic, Irish and English communities had recourse to the same repertoire of therapies, namely regimens of health, drugs, which were made from plants, minerals and animal extracts, surgery, especially bloodletting, and finally, and maybe surprisingly, charms. I want to give you an example of each. So in this and the next two slides, the Irish example is shown on the left and the English on the right. So first of all, just like us, medieval people were very conscious of health maintenance and well-being. And to maintain a good humoral balance and thus stay healthy, they followed various regimens of health, or regimen sanitatis, sometimes called regimen sláinte in Irish, which provided advice on manipulating which they called the 6 non-naturals. So just to explain, the naturals, this is what they thought, the naturals referred to the body's organs and normal functions, the non-naturals to external influences on the body, and the contra-naturals referred to disease. So you can see here the list of non-naturals. So it's air and environment, eating and drinking, exercise, rest, sleep, waking, inanition, repletion, and accidents of the soul, which means emotions. So this is a very modern list, and we could all identify with that. Now, the environment also included the disposition of the cosmos, which was worked out from astrology and astronomy and determined when and when was not a propitious time for a medical intervention. Now, I'm not going to say any more about astrology, because we'd be here for the day, but the Irish physicians were just as aware of its presumed influence as physicians elsewhere. So there are several copies of this regimen in Irish. You can see them all listed here. But I was unable to find a copy in Hiberno Middle English, although there are several in Standard English. So the first published English version is in 1541 by a Thomas Painel. So drugs or compounds were used to induce emesis, purgation, or sweating. Those are the three things that they wanted to achieve. And so just to take two examples, these are examples of prescriptions for constipation, one in Irish and one in Hiberno Middle English. So I should just say Hiberno Middle English was the English that was spoken by the descendants of the Anglo-Normans, especially in the cities and towns in Ireland. It was slightly different from standard or British Middle English, and that's why it's called Hiberno Middle English. So the prescription on the left says, "Es in ti arami kangal aun tower cleister do." So kangal means constipated and cleister means an enema. Merter salcuach agus hocus agus mercurial agus hocus moor, agus bran, agus cassius fistula, agus bacon salunid. So it means to him who is constipated, give a clyster, an enema, in which are boiled violets, mallows, mercurial, great mallows, bran, cassia fistula, and a little salt. In the Hiberno Middle English version, it says, if thou art costive, costive being the word for constipation, and thou wouldst make a nesh womb means a soft stomach, take malnas, mallows again, and set them well, and then cast there a cup of new ale, and thereof eat well, and thy womb shall nesh anon, thy stomach shall soften anon. And that was the English version. But it's very interesting that both versions used mallows as a treatment for constipations. The assumption that removing blood would drain away the corrupted humor and restore the balance was the rationale for bloodletting, which had great status as a therapeutic option across the medieval world, not just in Ireland. So it was frequent treatment in medieval Gaelic Ireland and in Anglo-Norman Ireland. So the image on the left is a vein or phlebotomy man, and it's an illustration which shows the precise vein to be let or bled for a specific disease or a symptom. For example, the one that I've highlighted with the red arrow says that bleeding from the cephalic vein was good for diseases of the head and of the brain. And so we know the word cephalic relates to this vein in the arm still in anatomy today, and we still refer to the head or as adjectively as cephalic. So these vein images were very popular throughout Europe and the Middle Ages, but this is the only extant Irish version of a phlebotomy chart. So the more elaborate chart here is an English version which says the same thing, but is written in Latin rather than in English. In contrast, in the Anglo-Norman community had recourse to a famous poem about bloodletting, which was described in rhyming verse the sites that should be bled for specific diseases. And so it begins, masters that useth bloodletting, and therewith get your living. Here may ye learn wisdom full good, in what place ye shall let blood. And I spoke about these two documents the last time, as Caoimhe said, when I spoke at the reunion. And it's interesting that the two documents do not match up in terms of which place to bleed for what disease. But anyway, it's interesting. Lastly, and interestingly, the medieval manuscripts also contain charms and incantations that might be recited to encourage healing or to prevent illness. So common problems for which charms were used included baldness, headache, impotence, eye and teeth problems, and especially staunching or stopping bleeding. These two charms shown here are for stopping bleeding. The Irish charm on the left contains the nonsense or gibberish words agor, agor, memor, memor, tap, tap, sep. And you can see it, I can't really point it easily on the thing. So it's difficult to explain it, but the charm starts on this line, goes to the end of the line, and then reverts up to the line above it. And presumably because of the value of the vellum, and they didn't want to waste any space. And then it goes from there down to the line underneath and finishes. So it reads, for the prevention of every flow of blood, agor, agor, memor, memor, tap, tap, sep, sep, set it thrice on the thumb and plunge it thrice against it, and it checks it. And that means it stops bleeding, apparently. So in Hiberno Middle English, the charm also for stopping bleeding is more like a prayer. So it starts another, because it's just given one charm already in the text. It says, Christ was born Ibor in Bethlehem, and baptize, which is Eve Fulad, in River Jordan. And River Jordan is Flim Jordan. So you can see it there, Flim Jordan. And as the Flim stood, so stands thy blood in omni patris, etc. So these were used as incantations or charms to try and stop bleeding. Of course, we all know that bleeding will eventually stop, so they were pretty much onto a winner with the charms. Occasionally, individual patients from both communities can be identified in the records. For example, the second on the list there, Edmund Mortel was partially mutilated by shot of gun in 1498. But he must have been well cared for, because the Annals of Ulster recorded that more than a score of children were born to him after that. So this is probably the first reference to a gunshot wound in Ireland. Further down, you can see on the last on the list there, Donncha Albanoch O'Crahur, our friend again, treated Fineen McDermott on Balloch for cancer bulgig. Cancer bulgig wasn't a cancer as we know it. It was probably smallpox. The word bulgach was used for smallpox in Irish in the Middle Ages. His therapy, however, may not have worked, as he later prayed that God would heal his patient. And among the English of Ireland, you can see that a number of people died from plague or the Black Death. John Klyn was a Franciscan friar from Kilkenny who provided the best eyewitness account of the Black Death in Ireland before succumbing to it himself. The sweat first appeared in England in 1485 and was characterized by fever, profuse sweating, and death, like death within 24 hours. It was an amazing disease, probably viral, but we don't know. And it disappeared just as it came. And there are no more cases of it after about the 1550s, something like that. Interestingly, the Abbot of Boyle died after having been bled for something or other. And this is possibly the first iatrogenic death in Ireland. So this fascinating medieval Irish medical world came to an end in the 16th and 17th centuries. Firstly, the Henrician Reformation did away with most of the Irish monasteries. And here you can see this is the act which instigated that from 1537, an act for the suppression of abbeys. And from there on, the abbeys were suppressed and the monasteries no longer part of the environment. The flight of the Earls removed the source of patronage for Gaelic poets, judges, physicians, and so on. The 17th and 17th century in general was a catastrophe for Ireland. From the Battle of Kinsale in 1601 to the 1641 rebellion, and then the Cromwellian and Williamite wars, confiscations, and settlements of the 1650s and 90s. The Jacobite poet, who came from Limerick, also called this century Purgadora Varnairn, purgatory of the men in Ireland. And he also used the word Lungbrisha, shipwreck, in relation to what happened to Ireland in the 17th century. So by the end of the century, the Gaelic and Old English worlds that I've been describing were shattered, and the new English planters firmly in control. Now, the decline in medieval medicine was not entirely political. Medical knowledge underwent a profound transformation during the 16th and early 17th centuries, with the publications by Andreas Vesalius, Ambrose Paré, and William Harvey, which overturned the medical ideas about anatomy, surgery, and physiology, and laid the foundations of modern medicine. And I'm delighted to see that Harvey and Vesalius get honorable mention in the stained glass here behind me. Personally, I think Harvey's idea that the blood circulates was the most seminal observation of the period, overturning 1,000 years of dogma. Physicians began to learn by observing their own patients rather than relying on the teachings of the ancient past and astronomical charts. Increasing number of aspiring doctors began to travel to European universities to gain medical education. Lawrence Brockless has calculated that between 1640 and 1800, over 1,300 Irishmen graduated with medical degrees from continental universities. Niall O'Dlacan, an Irish physician who was trained by the MacDontleva Medical Kindred in Donegal, became the professor of medicine at the University of Bologna in the 1640s. And while he strongly adhered to the authorities of Hippocrates and Galen, he also flirted with the very new ideas of pathological anatomy, thus bridging the gap between the traditional medieval medicine and the new scientific medicine of the 17th century. So if you want to, well, first of all, I need to acknowledge some people who have helped me a lot in this work. The first is Evie Nidonica, who is here and I have mentioned already. Thank you, Evie. And the second is Harry Griffin of the School of English, Irish and Communication in the University of Limerick. So this talk is based on two papers that I wrote, one in Irish Historical Studies and the other in the Proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy. Now, these are some of the resources if you want to pursue this further. CELT is supported by or hosted by University College Cork, and on there you will find hundreds of Irish documents and manuscripts in translation. For example, the Annals of Ulster, the Annals of the Four Masters, all that sort of thing is there to be seen on CELT. Irish Script on Screen is an absolutely fabulous website, and it has page by page of the manuscripts, some of which I showed you in the talk, from Ireland, Britain, and several hundreds of manuscript pages all there. And if you want to get really stuck in and try and translate any of these manuscripts, that's where you need to go. Light is a website hosted by the Department of Old Irish in Maynooth, and they put up manuscript of the month every month, which is very interesting. One of the most amazing things that's happened in recent years is the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland, which has attempted to recreate virtually the Public Record Office that was destroyed in 1922, and it is a wonderful resource. The Wellcome Collection has lots of manuscripts. The Hiberno Middle English text that I showed you is there, and Cambridge, Oxford, University of Edinburgh, British Library and Trinity and so on all have wonderful resources. And this is, just to go back to astronomy, this is an astronomical chart which was created by an Irishman in the 16th century. So this is a disc which can rotate around the page, and it can tell you where you are in relation to the zodiac and whether it's a good day to have your blood let or not. I just think this is an amazing piece of art, apart from anything else. And I just finished with that. Thank you very much.